Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sports Docs podcast. On each episode, we chat about the most recent advancements in the field of sports medicine with experts from around the country. Today, we're coming from you live from the 10th Annual Arthrex Team Physician Controversies Conference in Naples, Florida. I'm Dr. Ashley Bassett.
And I'm Dr. Catherine Logan. So the Team Physician Controversies is a 2-day course where experts from around the world come in to discuss everything from indications to treatment to return to play for professional and collegiate sports. We are lucky to have many of these experts in the studio today to discuss their insights.
So today's episode is going to focus on sports injuries in the media. We're joined today by Stephania Bell. Stephania is a licensed physical therapist, board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist, and certified strength and conditioning specialist. She regularly appears on ESPN's NFL and fantasy football coverage, including SportsCenter, The Fantasy Show, and Fantasy Football Now, in addition to co-hosting ESPN Audio's Fantasy Focus Football podcast. Stephania, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That's a lot of F's.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for being on our show. We're really excited to have you. But before we dive in, you have a very diverse background. We want to talk a little bit about that. So how did the intersection of your background in physical therapy and health really shape into media?
It's so funny. It's a question I get asked all the time. I keep trying to figure out the 2 to 3 sentence answer, and it never comes out that way. It's always longer. But basically, I went to physical therapy school and always had an interest in sports medicine, even though, you go through and you get, as you know, you go through all the rotations, but I always gravitated towards sports medicine and orthopedics. And when I first practiced, I got really interested in manual therapy, had kind of a broader orthopedic approach, and then wanted to drill down into sports a little bit. I ended up going from general manual therapy practice and manual therapy training to teaching position at KU, where I really got a lot of experience working with D1 sports, and also started doing some consulting in the performing arts space with traveling shows, which I had a performing arts background. So it was like this combo of D1. If you know anything about KU, basketball is like next to holiness in Kansas. And I was running the sports medicine clinic and also teaching. When I decided to go back to California, I took all of that and packed it up and with me and went back to teach in a post-professional program, a DPT program, ran a sports medicine clinic, and was doing performing arts consulting in San Francisco. And I had a range of athletes. We kind of built a sports medicine practice down there from youth athletes up to professionals. So that was my experience in PT. I also played fantasy football, and I got into that when I went back to California. And what I noticed was all these people in my league, very competitive co-ed league, were always asking me questions about recovery times. And I won't say how many years ago, but back in that time, there was not much on the internet related to the fantasy football was barely on the internet. People were still doing, pencil box scores, but it was harder to find information about injuries. So people would ask me, well, how long does it really take to come back from an MCL sprain? And I would start explaining, well, it depends on the positional demands and et cetera, et cetera. And the more people started asking questions, the more I thought there's got to be something I can do with this. And so I started exploring that space, and there really wasn't anybody doing injury analysis or coverage or reporting. And so I went to a little, at the time it was Fantasy Sports Trade Association, a lot of mom and pop businesses, Yahoo and CBS and ESPN were just getting in the space, and started asking around what people thought about this. And they'd be like, oh, that's different. That's really interesting. I'd love that content, but nobody's going to pay you to do that. And I thought, well, if enough of you like it, somebody will pay. And so ultimately I found my first spot writing for a magazine. And so I was doing all those jobs I told you about before. And then one night a week, I'd write this column. So it was basically, essentially for free. I think I got paid $25 a week for that. And almost pulling an all-nighter to do it. But it was my way of dipping my toe in the pool. And it started to catch on. They ended up doing a deal with SiriusXM. So I started getting on the radio. and that was before they even had a fantasy sports channel there, but they had a show where they talked fantasy sports. And then somebody I'd met through all of that, Matthew Berry, went to ESPN. They had bought his website, and they basically charged him with building the fantasy department. And we talked, and I was different. There weren't that many women playing fantasy football at the time, really not many at all. And there was nobody doing injuries full time. So they said, why don't you come out for an audition? I thought it went terribly. I had my visit to ESPN. I thought for sure that was the last time I'd be there. But one of the executives took an interest in the fact that I had this diverse background. I mean, it's what actually got me the job there. And I was hired on a 6-month contract, and I'm now in my 19th year. So
incredible. Wow. Congratulations.
And I think what's really funny, and I take, I take some pride in it, is that they asked me when I got there, what should we call you? Because I was hired as a senior writer who was writing, but you were doing, we had one of the first podcasts at ESPN. We currently have the longest running original podcast on the network. And I didn't know even how to explain a podcast to people because nobody knew what it was. Yeah. But we were doing television, podcasting, writing, et cetera. And I said, well, I think I'm an injury analyst because I saw reporters are reporting breaking news. I wasn't reporting news. Sometimes that filtered in, but the focus was really the analysis. And so we had basketball analysts and football analysts. And I said, well, I'm an injury analyst. And now I think if you go on the internet, you'll find a lot of people call themselves injury analysts. And that was, it didn't really exist. I just made it up. Yeah. So it's fun to see. Yeah.
Well, that is a remarkable story and segues really well into our next question for you, which is about fantasy football. So, injuries have become a really major storyline in fantasy football, arguably more important to a lot of people than the game results themselves. So why do you think that injuries have become so central to fantasy football conversations, and how has this changed the way the lay public engages with injury news?
Well, to go to the second part first, the lay public is so much more knowledgeable now than when I started. People throw terms around, ACL, that's this, they have plantar fasciitis. They say the words. If you ask them to point it out on a skeleton, they could not find it. But they know the terms because they've heard it enough. And injury reporting at large is so much more common. I think there's a familiarity that people are comfortable throwing the words around. But to fantasy football specifically, obviously the goal is to get the most points. For people who aren't familiar with fantasy football, you draft a team. So you have a positional team like a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a flex player, tight end, a defense. And the idea is, you're drafting from the pool of NFL players. Everybody drafts their own roster, and you have bench players too. So you have to set a starting lineup every week. And based on how the real player performs on a given day, you accumulate relative points. And so if you're going against another roster, you want your roster to have the most points. If you start a player who's injured or is coming back from injury, and they don't perform well, then you're going to have a lower score. So injuries are directly relatable to how well you perform in fantasy football each week. And I think that they're probably the most important question outside of if you have a split backfield at running back and who's the RB1 and who's the RB2. But the injury status is number one. And so I think that's why as fantasy football has grown in popularity, the need and the desire for information related to injuries is that much more prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you explained it really well. The injury, it's not just are they in or are they out? It's what is the injury and what does this actually mean? And I think you've been really important from changing it from what is their status to what is their function? Are they going to come back? Not even just with fantasy football, but that's a change to media directly. So can you talk a little bit about how long did that take for the shift to be from what's their status versus no, tell me more?
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure I can tell you that there was a moment that it happened, but I think as we've entered into more of an information age, everybody just wants more and more and more detail and more information. And I think the thing that helped me, double-edged sword, is everybody wants to, I just want to know, is my guy playing or not playing? Is he going to be good or not? Or should I start somebody else? That's the fantasy football mentality. But I found that, especially through the podcasting, and we used to do online chats, and the questions I would get, I was getting, concussions were a big thing. I was at ESPN when the NFL rule changes kicked in about concussions, and concussion protocols were being developed. And it was really being spotlighted throughout the country, especially related to youth sports and college sports and of course the pros. And I got a lot of parents who were podcast listeners who would say, well, I heard about this, or, Matthew had a great way of turning some of things that were serious. He'd make jokes out of them, but it would make it stick in people's heads. So we had an understanding that we would never joke about a player's injury. But for example, when concussions became such a big topic, I would say, well, concussions are like snowflakes. No two are exactly the same, and it really depends on the athlete. The injury, even within the same athlete, injuries can present very differently each time. And so there is no clear cut, it's very hard to determine a definitive return to play, and explaining to people that the prior terminology of mild, moderate, and severe had gone by the wayside because you really couldn't rate the level of injury until after somebody recovered, because you often didn't know at the outset. And they used to say, oh, it's just a mild concussion. So it became the joke on the podcast. Oh, he's just got a mild concussion, because they knew it would drive me crazy. But what happened was the audience really picked up on that. I still have people who will tweet at me like, oh, Stephania, like LOL, it's just a mild concussion, knowing that they're referencing a podcast joke. But what I saw was people are starting to understand that these injuries are nuanced, and that you can't just say person's playing, not playing, or this is an injury that takes 2 weeks to recover. You really have to appreciate that there's variance in every single athlete, and then that takes into account their injury history, their health, how they got injured this time, position, and so many more things, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. One of the things I think that's been really impactful in helping the public understand that injuries are nuanced is the Arthrex animations and some of those visible tools that are available. So how do you think these animations have changed the way that fans and even media professionals understand anatomy, injury mechanisms, and then recovery timelines?
I always think you can tell a story better with a picture. One of my biggest challenges when I started working at ESPN was, how can I convey this thing I can see in my head to people without it getting boring? Because when I say the words, it's not as interesting. And think about it, it's hard to separate yourselves from it now too, because you know it. But if you don't know anything about anatomy, you don't have a frame of reference. If I just describe anatomy, you're not going to be able to make that picture in your head. So visuals are extremely helpful, but they're hard to do. And creating a visual medium, now things have gotten so much better, but in the early days, trying to create something on the internet or some kind of visual that fans would appreciate was almost impossible to find. And it was either A, extremely expensive, or B, really rudimentary, or there were two ranges, rudimentary or like cadaver lab, which you can't show on TV.
No one wants that.
No one wants to see that. So trying to find ways to illustrate injuries was really tough. And one of the great things about getting to know Arthrex and developing this relationship over time is they have these really talented animators and the graphics department. And because they were creating so many things from an educational standpoint for their patients and their surgical audience, some of it fit really well. We don't need to show the whole surgery on ESPN, but sometimes just a little snippet of something that's being done with, the one that jumps to mind right now because we talk about it so much is the UCL, the primary repair with internal brace. And having that animation where you can see, oh, this is where it is, because you can have a line, they put a line like elbow, and people are, okay, now I understand where the UCL is. And then they see the internal brace laying atop the ligament. And I think all of a sudden people understand, oh, this is what that means. And so I think it's been incredibly helpful just in general feedback that I get, but even within the company at ESPN, because I'll have producers tell me afterward, I did not know that. Like I learned something just now. Yeah. So they're fascinated by it as well. And we all know in that industry that visuals help tell the story. So on the production side, they've been thrilled to have these graphics. This year we had one when the quarterback at Oklahoma had his thumb injury. Yeah. And when we showed some examples of the way you could fix this thumb fracture that he had. And, we had the Arthrex animation. It blew up. I heard about it from so many people because they had an ability to actually visualize what happens to the quarterback. And you put it on a program like College Game Day, where it's being seen by millions of people. And that whole audience walks away better informed.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that you pointed out, and it's really that storytelling. And I think the fan experience is they don't want to just know it happened. They really want to be like a part of the journey. They want to see, okay, they just showed me the animation. That is actually what the injury is. And now I'm like, I know what this athlete's going through. And you're really like taking them in for that journey. And, you talked about the internal brace, and, no one's going to know what they mean when they say internal brace, but you show a picture and you say, oh, okay, I understand why that's there. And I think it also gives them a little bit of an understanding of, why a recovery is what it is.
Yeah. And it's relatability too, because, the athletes aren't always the only ones getting these procedures, right? Yes. So every patient's like, they feel like, oh, I'm just like that athlete.
Totally. Exactly. So now you referenced earlier, nuanced conversations, right? So, everyone wants to talk about ACL, high ankle sprain. Do you eventually see this trend heading in the direction where we're talking about really meaningful things like athlete load management, long-term health, like concussion and brain health, and longevity of the athlete in terms of their ability to play long-term? Do you think eventually we'll get to that point with our audience? Or do you think it's just going to be the heavy hitter injuries?
No, I think we're already there.
Yeah.
Because those things are coming up. It's funny you mentioned load management, because that's actually something that I've talked about. I went to Spain with MBPA, doing a retreat there, and because load management's been such an issue in the NBA, and that term was thrown around to the point where they were, and all the athletes who were sitting out for load management, that became an issue. So then we had to have, the policy in place about how much load management there could be, which clearly is not really the way that we deal with load management, but it started a conversation. Now everybody's familiar with the term. What does that mean? And part of my going was to talk with Dr. Ashish Bedi, who's their medical consultant, and about what they're looking at with players to better understand what load means for an athlete. And then we put that on NBA Today. So it's making the transition to those conversations. The challenge, I think, is these are things we don't have an easy answer for. They are still conversations. They're complex topics, and people consume information in very short bites. So they don't want to hear us talk for 45 minutes about all the things that would have to go into a study to find out what is the best way to, figure out optimal load management for these type of athletes. They want the 2 to 3 sentence rundown of what that means. I think that intersection is hard because my bias is that sometimes when people try to deliver that, it doesn't do justice to the topic. And then that's a little bit of misinformation then that's out there. A lot of conclusions get drawn quickly with, these short kind of summarization. There's your AI stuff, you know? So I think that's where we have the challenge moving forward, is how can you have bigger conversations, but not like whittle them down or dilute them so much that they become meaningless.
Absolutely. It's like reading the abstract, but not the paper.
Exactly. Yes. I dig into the details.
So looking back to the last NFL season, there's obviously a lot of different injuries. And I think you've already highlighted communication has become such a big component, and the Arthrex animations and videos are trying to sort of help educate the public. But what are some notable injuries from the last season that stand out to you that were like all the animations, or it really helped the public understand?
Yeah, well, I think just mentioning the material when that wasn't NFL, that was college, but we've certainly. I'm trying to think of specific ones that we've used. I think, of course, the two that come to mind aren't NFL at the moment, but over time we've highlighted a lot of. I don't know, ankle injuries. The high ankle sprain is probably one of the Arthrex animations that I think has been the most helpful. So much so that people understand what a tightrope procedure is now, because and they can see through the animation how that actually happens. Because I think, again, go back to the audience and think of like tightrope.
What does that mean?
Somebody walking on a tightrope, and to find out that it's we understand why it is called that, but they can now see on the visual like how it bridges across the ankle joint. And high ankle sprains are definitely something that's been, I think, much more recognized in the last few years. I'm sure it saw us, meaning us in medicine in general, more than we saw it or recognized it 20 years ago. And now I think it's enough that at least the audience understands, and maybe wrongfully, it's oversimplistic, but they're like, oh, it's a high ankle sprain, that's bad. Yeah. If it's a low ankle sprain, lateral ankle sprain, that's not bad. Right. I'm like, well, those can be bad too. But they have an ability to discern these two things that they didn't before. And the number one injury burden in the NFL, so burden meaning time lost, is lower extremity strains. A lot of people think it's ACL, but it's really not, because the numbers, the volume of lower extremity strain makes that the number one injury. So hamstring strains, quad, Achilles. I think that's another thing that we've been able to use the Arthrex animation for, is for the Achilles repairs and the speed bridge technique. So people can see, that's what happens when you're having that repaired. And, again, Achilles injuries, they kind of fall on that continuum of the lower extremity strain.
Do you think those animations led people to have a better understanding in terms of risk of getting back into play, like Aaron Rodgers getting back so early after, and it was attributed to the speed bridge, which probably was a part of it. But do you think it makes people better able to understand like what goes into that surgery and kind of predict risk and ability to get back into play?
I think a little bit on the surface. Obviously there's so many factors that go into it, but I think just understanding, the essence of what the procedure is, because that's where the animation really comes into play, is sort of showing the injury, like where the damage is, and then showing some of these technologies that have helped along the way. I think we still have a ways to go to get them to understanding relative risk. And one of the things that's hard with the general audience is, extrapolating like this is what Aaron Rodgers can do. It might not be what you can do.
Probably not.
And it might not be what most athletes can do. And there are also all these other things that factor into it. I find myself talking a lot about, seasonal calendar and, there's contract issues that sometimes can dictate whether someone's going to play or not play. And as far as like injury data and return goes, that can factor in as well. We're seeing players who are maybe not playing at the end of a season, knowing that they're going into free agency. So if they have a minor injury, they may not play. And so that injury gets labeled as something that kept them out for X amount of time. But if that was a team going to the Super Bowl, maybe they're back a little bit sooner. So it's still nuanced. Yes. And if somebody can figure out for me how to capture all of that, I'd love to hear it. But the visual aspect of the storytelling remains unparalleled, because that really is what helps bring the audience along, I think.
Absolutely.
And I think that lends into the last thing we want to wrap up in is misconceptions. So you've already hit on some of them.
It's a whole nother podcast.
Like return to play timelines are exact, or then, that, if the player's on the field, that means they're healthy. So I think there's things out there, but beyond what you've just mentioned, what are some misconceptions that we still need to tackle?
Yeah, I think you just are hitting on the biggest ones, which is, unfortunately, the the timelines is a really problematic one for me. So you take something like an MCL injury, and you'll hear that a player got a scope and 2 to 4 weeks, right? Yeah. So then every MCL becomes 2 to 4 weeks, unless they need surgery. And we know that there's a lot of room in between this, really simple, non-operative recovery for a mild grade 1 to a complete tear that needs a surgical approach. And there's a lot of variation in between. And we might all know that, well, their anatomy, their structural anatomy plays a different, what kind of position are they getting back to, and what are the demands on the MCL, and all of those things, which when you talk to the audience, you have a chance to explain all that. They hear it. But on the front end, they don't really appreciate that there are these differences. It kind of goes back to just the nuance of the injury. So the misconception lies in the timeline, that they're universal. Or if we talk about a player who's done something like Aaron Rodgers, where they've pushed this boundary on the Achilles recovery, that then all Achilles recoveries, therefore going forward, are going to look like that, right?
Exactly.
And the fact is that most people are going to go at a different rate. And there were some very specific factors that kind of played into why he was on that timeline and what he was able to do that are different than what most everybody else is going to do. So I think that's a big one. And then also just along with that all rehab is the same. I mean, I really feel that as a physical therapist. I think people think there's like this formula of, you just do A, B, C, D for these guys. Like, you know what to do. They come in and you do these things and then they are better. And it's like, no, it's fluid. It's dynamic. There's not a recipe for each thing. I'm talking to, preaching to the choir here, but that is really the challenge of conveying that consistently. I feel like a broken record sometimes on the air, because you're also getting, when it's in the media, you get the agents saying, successful surgery, they're going to be ready to start the season. And you're like, well, if you take Tyreek Hill, for example, who had this awful knee dislocation, and we know how complex those can be. And so we got some information of, whatever, certain, we knew he had his ACL repaired, but you're not hearing much about everything else. And his agent's like, he's going to be ready to start next season. So I'm like, well, that's great that we are encouraged, but we all know there's a lot to go between this point and the end point. And so I think that leads to misconception as well, as sort of a projection immediately after the injury, whether it's surgical or not, but especially the more complex things we try and explain. This is going to take some time. I think the last part of that is you hear about these athletes who push the limit, and they get rewarded for it and applauded for making an early return, which I think is a double-edged sword, because you can't always push the return because of biology, and it really depends on the injury. And there are some injury and recovery situations where you don't want the athlete to be accelerated, but because it's so rewarded in the media, or when somebody makes a return, they didn't think he'd be back for X amount of time and he came back early. It concerns me when I see players who I know are pushing to make it back by week 1 of the season, and it really doesn't feel like they're ready. But it's such a big statement publicly for them to be on the field week 1 that they might return before they're really ready to play. They might be medically cleared, but you know what I'm talking about. I always say return to play, return to performance are two different things. Right. And so they may be struggling, and then there's a price to pay for that sometimes, whether it's their stats aren't up to par, or the public perception is that they aren't what they were before the injury. And I'm thinking, well, maybe they're still going to get there, but that's, and mentally, it can take a huge toll on the athlete. So I still think there's a long way to go in just speaking to the variability of injuries and recovery. with athletes.
I think you made a really good point there about people going back early. I think something we see a lot is people, hamstring strain, they get back in 3 weeks and then they're back out, then they're back in, then they're back out, and then they're back in. It's to the point that you almost just wish they would take the time, right? But as you said, it's a badge of honor to try to get back as soon as possible and help their team. I think what I'm hearing from you and what I think our listeners should take away is that this is multifactorial, right? People, this is not
Nobody
this
wants
is not
to
a lab
hear
rat.
it, but it's just the truth,
Yeah, they're humans with different positions, different body habitus, different levels of injury. We don't know what their MRI looks like. We're not looking at it.
Right.
So I just think hopefully the thing our listeners take away is that this is multifactorial and it takes into account a lot of different evidence.
Yeah. And Stephania, this has been so insightful, and you're an expert that's really elevated not just professionals' awareness, but the public's awareness of athlete health. And you're doing a great job out there, and we loved having you on today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Sports Docs, live from the Arthrex Team Physician Controversy Conference. We hope you enjoyed our conversation today as much as we did. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and on YouTube to stay up to date on all things sports medicine.